Hello and welcome. So this is the first tutorial in the Illustrator 2021 tutorial series. And so we're going to start with the basics, right? This is for a course where some students do already have some experience using Illustrator, which is fantastic. And there's a lot of other students that have no experience using Illustrator. So the goal is to get everyone up to speed, to have some sort of common ability to use the software. All right, so first, Illustrator, right? The app icon is AI, if you are unfamiliar with that. Go ahead and open it and we'll get started. So one of the things we need to talk about first is what is the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator? Why are there these two digital imaging programs available from Adobe? And so the first thing we need to talk about is what's the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator. So they have two primary different use cases and different ways that they function. So Photoshop, as we've gone through the Photoshop series of tutorials, is a raster-based imaging program. And what that means is, right, I think I've talked about this in the other tutorials, but you're actually coloring each individual pixel in the image, and you're doing a lot of work with all your layers and your blending and all of that to basically say this pixel in this location should be this particular color. Now, and that allows for really amazing things to happen, but it also has some limitations, right? One of the things is when you're painting with Photoshop, once you've set a brush stroke, the brush stroke stays exactly where it is, and there's no changing the shape. Like if you make a beautiful stroke and then at the end you like twitch and spasm and you're not happy with it, there's no fixing that. You have to undo it and redo it. In Illustrator is what's called a vector drawing program or a vector imaging program. And vectors are essentially a list of instructions for how to draw something, right? So you're actually giving the computer a set of coordinates and how to move from one set of coordinates, one XY position on the screen to another XY position on the screen, what the border of that should look like, what the fill color, if it's a solid shape, should look like. And there's, right, you're basically giving just a set of instructions. Now, what's really awesome about that is that you can go through and adjust those instructions at any time, right? So if you draw a brush stroke and it isn't, the perfect curve that you would like it to be, you can go back in and you can tweak and fix that. You can move these different objects around the screen. You can scale them. One of the other really nice things about anything that you do as a vector file is that it is more or less infinitely scalable. And what that means is whether you make it absolutely, the size of a pinhead, or you make it the size of, the size of a building. In either case, because it's just a set of instructions, Illustrator can scale the artwork up to whatever size. Now, sometimes there's fine details and things that you wouldn't see until you blow them up really huge, and you might need to make some adjustments if you're taking something that you drew that was, meant for like an Instagram post, and you're like, oh, I'm actually going to put this on the side of a building. There might be some things that you need to tweak and adjust to make it look right. But overall, the fact that you can scale it and you have there's no pixelation that you see, right? You actually just scale the artwork and all the lines look great. And so, right, Illustrator is, very frequently used to do any sort of graphic design work, right? Logos, typefaces, posters, web design, right? Any sort of those assets where you need something that's going to be migrated across different potential media and scaled in different ways, put on banners, etc. Right? All of that work typically happens in Illustrator. Another way Illustrator is used very frequently is for developing 2D video game assets, because you can create, like, say, this road tile that I've created for another course that's here, right? You can create things that you can very quickly modify and make adjustments to, right? Because these are all just instructions, I can select this green box that's in the background and I could change it to yellow or orange or purple or whatever, change the road color, change the stripe color, and I can do that with a few clicks. And so it allows me to very quickly generate, a huge assortment of, potential environments in a game. And one of the places, I have this link on Canvas, but one of the places that has a lot of examples of what you can do with Illustrator is on Behance, which is a service from Adobe. If you go to Discover and select the Illustrator tag, right, you can see what people are making with Illustrator, and you can get some sense of the kind of amazing like range of work that you can do. So, right, one of the things that really sets the two apart is you don't use images or edit images in the same way, right? Like, so photographs or any sort of JPEG or PNG, you can bring in, and there's things you can do with it, and you can set it as part of your artwork. Like in this example, right, they drew these shapes on top of this black and white image that they brought into Illustrator. But you can't edit the image like you can in Photoshop, right? That's why Photoshop exists, is that you can apply filters, you can do all sorts of, brightness and contrast and all of that work in Photoshop, and then you can bring that final image into Illustrator and do the graphics work that you want to do on top of it. Now, some of these other things, some of this character design stuff, some of these are things that, like, if I can't remember if it's this one, but there's some where they're showing you parts that were done in Illustrator and then taken into other software, right? So, or printed on physical media. And so some of these are just Illustrator. Some of them, especially if it's more like 3D stuff, right? Illustrator did those graphics are from Illustrator, but these fruits are probably not. Now, that said, people do photorealistic work in Illustrator as well. And so, but you can roll through here and you can see kind of the range of possibilities that exist when you create things using Illustrator. Yeah, so please take a look at this, get some inspiration for what is possible, and let's go ahead and get started with actually looking at the interface and using Illustrator. Okay, so when you open Illustrator, this is what you're presented with. Now, if you have a Wacom tablet, just as you can use it in Photoshop, you can use that in Illustrator as well. I always get an alert that something's wrong, but my tablet still seems to work. And I'm not really wanting to update the drivers right now and potentially introduce more problems. So I'm going to just leave it in its like partially functional state. So you can either go to Create New, or if you have any previous projects, there is also some, a quick set of presets here. I'm going to click on Create New. Now, I've got a couple custom square artboards in here that are 2048 pixels by 2048 pixels. What I'm going to want you to do is we'll start by just creating one of these. So the way you do that is, like, say it's on, I don't know, it's one of these other options. Let's see here. Say it's web. That's one that you probably have, or film and video. And so what it gives you some preset details, right? So I can just go ahead and change these two values and to both to 2048, and that will do everything that I need to do. Now, just note that there are some options here. Color mode's RGB, that's important. Note that if I click on one of these that says print, my color mode is CMYK. Now, the reason there's the difference there is that print imagery, right, when you go to print things, typically, I mean, modern printers are a little different, but typically there are, 4 colors that are used in print media to print everything. And so that's why you have this color spectrum. Things are a little different. Your blacks are not going to be as dark. And there's some other changes that take effect. For this project, we're going to deal with doing things for digital media, right? So we're going to be working with RGB color, right? This is RGB color is anything that's going to be screen based, typically uses RGB, not CMYK. And then it says raster effects screen 72 pixels per inch. We can go ahead and leave that set for now because, again, this is for the screen. We want a lower resolution because we don't want all that excess image size and weight bogging our artwork down. Once you get, right, 2048 by 2048, just go ahead and hit create. And it will open the interface. And so the interface has, I assume yours will look something like this. Let me go ahead and make sure I'm in the, there we go. I'm in the essentials layout. So first, you know, a button that as you work with this and as you learn how Illustrator works and you go and you want to do different things with it, this layouts button up here at the very top is really nice. There's the essentials, which is like your default. Essentials Classic makes one minor change. And then if you're doing layout or painting or printing and proofing or image tracing or typography or web-based work, they just basically bring out different tools. So if I click on painting, no, maybe it's not painting. Sorry, there's one where it brings out different tools over here. There's one that really drastically changes what tools are available on this side as well. But we're going to start with essentials, and we'll really only move into the other modes later, right? So much like Photoshop, all of your tools are over here. You'll notice these all look a little different, except maybe a couple. And then there are your properties, and there's a layers panel here, libraries, which we don't need to worry about right now. But you'll note that when I click on this, I have these 3 tabs over here, and I have the same 3 options here, right? And so if I click on transform, it's going to close that, and it's going to pop open anything that's in this little chunk of the menu, right? And if I go down to appearance, all I've got in there is appearance, so that's the only thing that's going to show up. There's color, and then the color guide, and then swatches, brushes, and symbols, right? And so there's, you know, a range of different, you know, options over there. There's your, you know, drawing tools and selection tools and things over here. And then again, just like Photoshop, you have your tool options up here, and then there's some options for your document setup and preferences, which, you know, I'm not sure why they show those up there. And then there's the select similar objects, which we're not going to be worried about right now. Okay. So, and then at the top of the screen, you'll see that there's, you know, your standard menu. There's file, edit, and then this object menu, which we'll talk about later, and type, and select, and effect, view, window, and help. Okay. So how do we get started in Illustrator? So the first thing is any of the quick keys that, and most of the keys that are tied to tools are similarly tied to tools in Illustrator. Again, if you hover over a tool, that the letter in the parentheses is the quick key, right? So if I need to use the selection tool, I hit the letter V. That is standard throughout all Adobe software. If I want to be able to select something more finely, the letter A, so it's direct selection. These 2 tools are really crucial in using Illustrator, right? Because one of the things that we're going to do, where generally in Photoshop you select an entire layer and move something around or scale it, and it's only rarely that you would, with some of the transform tools, that you would pull a single point around. In Illustrator, you're pulling points around all the time. That's like one of the main ways that you create work in here. And there's a magic wand tool. We're not going to talk about that too much, right? Selection tools exist, but it's not really the same as selection tools in Photoshop, right? We're not going to be doing cropping or cutting or anything like that. You know, there's something called a clipping mask that we will work with, but it's a little different. Okay, so there is text tools. There's a line segment tool. Note that there are arrows on the corner of all of these. So if I click and hold, other options pop up in there. There's a brush tool and this thing called a blob brush tool, which is probably my favorite tool in Illustrator. Under the shaper tool, there's the pencil, smooth tool, path eraser, etc. Right, and this is the standard eraser. You hold Shift E to select that, not E. E selects the free transform tool, which is one difference with Photoshop. But there's a scale tool, rotate tool, width tool. You know, it's rare that you need to actually select the scale or the rotate tool because you can do those things on your own. But there is also the shear and the reshape tool under there. And then there's this reflect tool as well that just kind of breaks out some of that thing. So you'll notice like all the transform tools that in Photoshop you have to go to the edit menu and go to transform it to get, they're all broken out here because we use them a lot more. And we're not going to talk about all of these tools yet, but we're gonna get started. So to begin with, let's go ahead and just create some basic shapes. So if I click on the rectangle tool and hold, you'll see I can create a rectangle, a rounded rectangle, an ellipse tool, a polygon tool, star tool, and this flare tool. We're not going to worry about flares right now. It basically makes a lens flare effect, and that's cool and all, but we don't need to cover it yet. So let's go ahead and select our rectangle tool, and we're just going to click and drag, and it always starts in the top left corner, and you drag out to the bottom right corner. Now, if you hold down Option, you'll see that you get this, the crosshair changes a bit, and if I click and drag, I actually start at the center of the object and pull out uniformly in the other two directions. Now, if I want this to be a square rather than like a freely transformable rectangle, I just hold down Shift as well, and I get a square, right? And so that same thing. So if I just hold down, if I click, I hold down Shift and click. Right, I pull from the corner, but I'm also making a square. Right, so those are my options. Now these are really exciting rectangles. They're white with a black outline. And so how do I make some of those changes? So first, we need our selection tool so we can select the different objects. So if I hit the letter V on the keyboard or click on the black arrow up here, I can select the entire shape, right? And I can move this shape around the screen wherever I want it to. If I hover over the corner, right, I can rescale this, and if I hold down Shift, it will keep it in the same proportions as it scales as to whatever it was previously. Again, right, I can adjust things with the center lines here, so I just adjust those. If I hold down Option while I click on, hold on a second. If I hold down Option, if I hover over this, and give me a second, if I select this, and hover over this and click and drag, I can scale both sides evenly. And right, if I hold down Option and click and drag this, it'll freely transform the whole thing. It doesn't really make any difference. And then there's one other icon or one other bit on here that I want you to note. There's these circles in the corners, and you'll note my icon changes to a curve. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to take your normal rectangle and create a rounded rectangle, basically down to like a capsule kind of shape, right? And you'll see when it hits red, that means that's as far as it can possibly go. And that's because those two handles, the one from this corner and the one from this corner, are meeting right there on the center line of the object, right? So this allows me to do this, and this isn't just with rectangles, this is with any shape. So if we go ahead and go down and let's go ahead and create a polygon. And I'm just going to click this polygon and pull it out. Now, something to note with polygons, I haven't let go of it yet because if I hit the up arrow, I get more sides, right? And if I hit the down arrow, I get fewer sides all the way down to a triangle, right? So you can adjust the number of sides based on this. And I'm going to go ahead and just leave this as a hexagon. And I'm going to release it. And when I do that, you'll see I have this one corner I can click on. And again, I can round the corners of this object. This is something that is available for any hard-cornered object in Illustrator. Okay, so to rotate, right, I hover outside the corner just a little bit. This is just like rotating a layer in Photoshop. And then there's this, for this shape, there's this additional little handle here with the plus and minus. That allows me to then adjust the sides after I've set the shape. Right, so I can just click and drag and it will adjust the number of sides on this. I really like that triangle with the rounded corners, so I'm going to leave it as a triangle. Okay, so this is some of the ways we can move and reshape objects in the scene, some of the basics. So let's look at how we change the fill and stroke colors, and we'll go on from there. Okay, so to change fill and stroke, we can either choose the colors here on the panel, or we can come up here to this top bar and choose the colors here. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to change the colors of whatever object we have selected, right? So if I click here and go to magenta, right? Now this has a magenta fill. If I come here and I go to yellow, you can't see it at all. Let's maybe do a dark blue. You can kind of see that. And my stroke is really, really thin. So let's look at this. So right next to this is our stroke settings. And so I'm going to go ahead and let's just make this really big, a 40 pixel stroke. Right? So you can see that I can very quickly and easily create an object with a stroked outside and a fill on the inside. Something to note, this no symbol over here means that there's no fill. So that means that it's transparent, right? So now if I've done that and now I drag over this, you'll see that I can see through to the objects below, right? And so you can see that if I move these around, even though they're white, right? So they actually have a white fill, so they're hiding the object below them. And then this object is on top. Let's go ahead and give this fill again. And why don't you go ahead and quickly just fill and color each one of these objects slightly differently and adjust your stroke width so it's a little bit thicker. And I'm just going to leave this one with a black stroke on the outside, and I'll make it, again, big. Okay. All right, so I've made these different layers. Now what I'd like you to do is go ahead and, or these different layers, these different images, go ahead and overlay all of them. And there's a couple ways. You'll notice that whatever I drew last is by default on top of everything else, right? This triangle was the last object I made. This big rectangle was the first object I made, and the small square was the second one. So I'm going to go ahead and put these all in order so they're overlapping from bottom to top. So go ahead and rearrange those a little bit. You'll note that it's really, really fast to move things around and refigure things in Illustrator, which is really great. So I've got these 4 layers. So one of the things that we need to know how to do early on is how to adjust the arrangement of these layers, or of these objects. I keep saying layers and I apologize, right? So there's these different objects. They're all on one layer right now. If I click on the layers panel and flip this arrow open to drop this down, you'll see I have these 4 objects on my layer, and you can see which one is selected by this big blue square here. If I want to change the selection in this menu, it's not by selecting the word over here. You'll notice nothing has happened here. It's by actually clicking over here to the far right of this little pane. That allows me to change my selection. If I want to select multiple objects using the layers panel, I just hold down Shift. And if I have this one, bottom one selected, and I click here, I can select, right, each of those. It doesn't do the shift click selection like normal. If I want to deselect one of them, but leave the other 3 selected, I can hold Shift and click to deselect that one, right? The same thing works out here. If I select this object and I hold down Shift, I will select these 2 objects, right? If I click and drag off in space, that will allow me to select anything that's within the bounds or gets touched by this little, dancing ants outline, right? So in this case, I've selected everything, but if I click and drag down here, I've only selected those 2 objects. Okay. So how do we move these, like say we want this to be below this orange thing. There's a couple ways we can do that. First, if we have the layers menu open, we can just click and drag to pull this down 1 level so that it's behind this, right? The other way we can do that, I'm going to go ahead and reset this. The other way we can do that is if we select our object in the scene on the artboard and we right click and we go down to arrange and we say send backward, that will send it backward 1 level. If, however, we right click on it and we go down to arrange and we say send to back, then what it's going to do is it's going to make it the very bottom image on the layer, right? So it's the very bottom shape that we've got. Okay. All right, so some other things to know, right? So that's this is some basic navigation and object creation stuff. If you click on properties, what properties does is it tells you everything you need to know about this object, right? So I've got this thing selected. It's telling me my fill, my stroke, my opacity, which we haven't talked about, but right, you can make these things transparent. And there's a couple other settings we'll talk about in a bit. But then also there's the transform, right? So the X and Y is my position on the screen of this center point, right? If I select this field and I was to say make this 1,000, right? Oh, I actually made it 100, but that's all right. You can see it shifted all the way over here, right? And if I move this around, right, it moves those values. You'll note that it actually keeps track of what angle this is rotated at. Currently it's at 30 degrees. If I jump to 180, it'll flip it for me. I can also just set, 23.5 degrees or something like that as what I want that value to be. And then there's the width and height, right? So I can numerically set how big this is too. So I can say I really want this to be 500 pixels. And you'll see it tweaks it a little bit, but it's pretty close. And part of that is it's trying to maintain the width and height proportions. And so I made it 500, but it pushed it down a couple units and made the other one bigger, which is fine. These little arrows give us more options, right? And so in this case, right, this shape has several different options. One is I can increase the number of sides, right? Again, here's my angle of rotation. This is sort of the center line of this thing, and there's a couple things here that don't really matter, but we can adjust this corner radius as well. So I can make this, if I just made it 5, right, they're gonna be a little bit rounded if I zoom in, which, by the way, if you hold down Option and use the scroll wheel, or use 2 fingers on your trackpad, you can, hold down Option and use 2 fingers on your trackpad, you can zoom in and out. Right, so you can see there's a curve here, but it's only 5 degrees, so it's really, really tiny, or 5 pixels, so it's really tiny. But if I make this 50 again, right, that's going to be a much bigger curve. So I'm going to use Option and the scroll wheel to zoom out. If I use the scroll wheel just by itself, or use my 2 fingers on my trackpad, 2 fingers on my trackpad will allow me to move in the X and Y direction, right? So I can move my artboard and around my view. If I hold down Command, and if I'm using a mouse and I use the scroll wheel with Command held down, it'll go right and left. If I let go of that, it'll go up and down. And then again, Option will zoom in and out. Now, if you're in Windows, right, it'd be Control, and using the scroll wheel will get you the up and down motion. Or sorry, the left and right motion. Yeah. Okay. So that's some more navigation stuff. This big white thing that's here is called an artboard. And Illustrator is different than Photoshop in that you can have artworks, you can have part of your artwork on the artboard or not on the artboard. There's no, I think there might, if I zoom out far enough, there is some boundary, right, where you can't go past. But, and even that, apparently you can go past it, right? They give you some warning that you're like way off in outer space. But, right, there's not as many, you're not so confined to just use the artboard. You can, when you export this as a PNG or something like that, you can say whether to trim things off at the edge of the artboard or whether to to export something that actually has the whole artwork. So, if I had that object out in space and these here, I could either say, oh, I just want the ones here. This is something that maybe it's like some draft work that I'm working on and I decided not to include it. Or I can say, no, I actually want this whole composition to come in, even though the artboard's a little bit too small, right? You can rescale the artboard at any time as well, right? We set this as 2048 pixels by 2048 pixels, but there's this tool down here called the Artboard Tool. If I click on that, I can actually go ahead and make this larger. You can create multiple artboards in one file. So you can have, right, if you were doing, say, a series of logos, or maybe, as I was talking about earlier, you're creating a variety of different like road tiles or assets for a video game. You can create a whole bunch of artboards that are the same dimensions, and you can have all of those tiles on each one of the different artboards, or all of those logos on a different artboard. And it's just a nice way to organize things and not have to have a whole bunch of files open at once, because you can have a bunch of things happening in a single file at once, which is a really, really nice feature. And Photoshop has started to implement that as well. We didn't really talk about it too much in the previous tutorials, but you can create artboards and have multiple artboards in one file that in Photoshop as well now. Okay, so we've done some basics in terms of, general shape building. So let's look at some of the other tools. And this is really just a way for you to start playing, to get like an understanding of where things are and how they function. If you've done this before, for this tutorial for the course, what I would like you to do is just create something, have some fun with it. If you're like, oh, I know all these tools and know how all the options work, then fantastic. But we're going to go through a couple more. And really, we're going to focus on shape drawing tools. We're not going to worry about the brushes right now, or the eraser, or any of these shaper tools, or any of the other things here. But this one is really just more about drawing shapes. So the other tools that allow us to draw shapes and give us significantly more control over how to draw shapes are the pen tool and the curvature tool. And so the pen tool has been around since the dawn of time, and we used it briefly in Photoshop to create a vector path as the work path that we created. So let's go ahead and use the pen tool to start with. So the pen tool, you'll note that there's an asterisk by the icon right now, and what that means is that it's in the state where it wants to create a new path rather than add anything on to an existing path. So if I click once, it'll create a point. If I just go ahead and click again, it'll create another point, and what it'll do with a single click is create a hard corner. And if I click again, it'll create another point, and you'll notice that even though this shape isn't closed, right, it's filling. Illustrator automatically creates fill where it can when you have more than 2 points, right? If you have your fill on, right, if this isn't turned off, then it's going to automatically start creating fill. And if I keep clicking, you'll see that that fill will change shape until the point where I close this. And to close a shape in Illustrator, you hover over the point that you started with, and you'll get that little O symbol. And when you get that little O symbol, that means if you click on this, it's going to close the path, right? Okay, so I've created this hard-cornered shape. So let's look at how else we can use the pen tool to create soft-cornered shapes. So if I'm going to start with a hard corner. We're going to make like just kind of a blob to start with. So I'm going to go ahead, and the blob's going to be sitting on a flat surface. So I'm going to go ahead and create one point here. I'm just going to come over. Now, if I hold down Shift, when I do this, it'll force it to be at 90 degrees, 45 degrees, or, right, it'll either be perpendicular to the bottom of the image, or parallel with it, or at a 45-degree angle from it. So, and that works all the way around the circle, right? You can go all the way around there. But we're just going to come over, and then I'm going to click once more. Now what I want to do is I want to create my blobbiness. So I'm going to come up to somewhere, more or less in the center of this line, and I'm just going to click and drag. And you'll note that when I click and drag, it's actually making this curve, right? That's and these two things that are sticking out. The two things that are sticking out are called handles, and they're what allow me to shape the curve. And you'll notice that the way that this was set up, for whatever reason, it made it opposite what I want to do. So I just want to rotate my handles around. And then if I make my handles more or less, if I hold down Shift, I can do the same thing with the handles, right? I can either say, oh, it should be 45, which is actually going to make it a nice hard corner, or I can flip it to 0 or, negative 45 or whatever, right? So I'm going to leave it here. I'm just going to let go. And when I do that, right, it draws that curved line. Now you'll note that it's this other line that's now coming here is telling me, like, if I click wherever I'm at, that's the shape I'm going to get, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and what I want to do is I want to click drag again. If I click here, it'll make another hard corner. So I'll get this rounded thing, but then it'll be a hard corner. But I want to create kind of like a swoop thing through there. So I'm just going to, hover right about here, click and drag just a little bit so that I get that rounded corner. And then I'm going to come down and I'm going to go ahead and make this finish. Now you'll see that when I do that, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. So I'm going to hold Option. I'm going to roll through here. And you'll see that now I can't use this handle. Like what I want to do is I want to be able to use this handle to adjust this shape, but I can't do that with the pen tool. If I hover over the line, however, anywhere where there isn't a point, and I actually get over the line, you'll see a plus sign shows up. That plus sign means that I can create a new point. If I want to get rid of a point, I can hover over an existing point. It turns into a minus. I click on it and it disappears. Now I'm going to go ahead and undo those last two steps by hitting Command Z. Because what I want to do is I want to modify this point. So how do I select this point and make a change to those handles? What I need to use is the Direct Selection tool. And the Direct Selection tool is this white arrow here. It's also the letter A on the keyboard. We use these two things so much, it's good to just start using A and V to switch between them so that you get used to that, because it's way faster than moving your mouse all the way up in the corner and selecting the button. So now I can click on any individual point on my object. And if I want to adjust the handles, then I just hover over the handle and I click and drag, and I can reshape, right, this thing. I can twist it inside out on itself if I want to, right? I can reshape this. I can click on the point itself and I can move this point around. I could come up here to this point, all right? I could move this around. And if I accidentally deselect everything, I can click back on the point or hover over the line and make a change there. And for some reason, I don't know if it's a level of zoom or what, but there we go. But I'm having trouble grabbing this handle, right? So now, one thing you'll note is that these handles are tied together. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit the letter H, which is the hand tool. It also allows me just to use my mouse to click and drag to move this over. If you're using a trackpad, it's easier just to use your two fingers to reposition things. So I'm going to hit the letter A again. So I want you to note that with this, right, these handles are locked together, right? If I click over here, the changes are the same. I can adjust the length, which is going to adjust how gently, how gently or how intensely this curve happens. And I can adjust the angle of the curve. But something that, like imagine you want to make a heart shape, right? Where you're going to need a lump to a hard point and then a lump. And let's say we wanted this to be kind of, right, to have that same kind of shape. How do I adjust this? What you do is you hold down the Option key, and you get this little plus symbol. And if I click on this, oh, sorry, let me try this again. So you select this and I believe it's the Option key. Okay, yeah, so this will work. So if I select the pen tool and I hold down the Option key, it will give me the tool that I need, which is this anchor point tool. And when I do that, what it does is it'll break that anchor point, right? So it allows these handles to be freely manipulated. And allows for significantly more interesting objects to be made, right? So I can drop that down, I can come over to this one, I can click and drag and pull this around as well, right? And so now I'm starting to get something that looks like it's a logo, like a really basic logo for like a gear, like a mountaineering gear store. Now, if I adjust these a little bit, all right. So these are some of the basics of these shape building things. So a couple more things I want to show you. If you hover over the line segment, which right between any of these two things called anchor points, is a line segment. If I hover over that line segment, that's another way that I can make adjustments. I can actually just click on the line segment and drag it around to reshape this thing as well. Right. So there's several options for how I work with this. And I do want you to note that once I've broken an anchor point, it stays broken, right? They are not linked together any longer. So that's just something to note. I'm going to go ahead and, select this point. And for some reason, I don't know why, but I keep missing. All right, there we go. Okay, so now I've got, you know, a significantly more interesting shape. So let's look at the curvature tool, and then we will, your assignment for this tutorial is to experiment with these tools. There's one other thing we'll need to look at, I guess. Okay, so I've made this shape, and I've got this other shape. Let's look at the curvature tool real quick. So the curvature tool is similar to the pen tool, and I'm going to go do this off the artboard, but it just changes how these things work. And so you first, let's go ahead and undo that. So I click to create one point, I click to create a second point, and it isn't until I move my mouse away from that second point that I start to create curves. And it shows you, right, this blue line is sort of like your preview of what's going to happen. And so then I can click and create this and create this. Now note that with the with this tool, there isn't an easy way to, if I click and drag, all it does is show me where this point is going to go. But there isn't an easy way to create like a hard corner with this, right? Except this like final point here where I connected them, and that is actually a hard corner, right? So the curvature tool is similar to the pen tool, but it just acts a little bit differently, and it allows you to create shapes in a little bit different manner. And really, it's a preference thing. They both work well, and you can use them in conjunction. So I can switch to the pen tool, and if I wanted to delete that point, I can delete that point. You know, if I use the direct selection tool, the letter A on the keyboard, right, I can click and I can adjust handles just like I would. I can, if I use the pen tool, which by the way is the letter P, and then hold down Option, right, I can click and make this a hard point, right? So you can use them together. But if you prefer to start drawing with a curvature tool, go for it. Prefer to use a pen tool, great. Whatever works. Okay, so something else that we need to talk about is the direct selection tool is not just good for working with the pen tool, but it's also good for any object that we've created in Illustrator. I can select any point and move it around, right? So I can reshape these to be whatever shape I want them to be, you know, and I can use the pen tool to subtract points. What? There we go. I don't know. I must have missed. I don't know why I got that error. That might be a first. I think I actually need to update my version of Illustrator because something like a new version, a new update just came out that fixes some errors, and I feel like I'm probably experiencing some of the problems that were with that in that last version. Right, so anyway, I can use this, I can select this, I can click on these corners and do whatever I want. I can actually go ahead and use the curvature tool as well. So I can come in here and use the curvature tool to adjust these points. And so really it just depends on how you do it. Now note with the curvature tool, there is the, right, some of these have dots. Those are the hard corners, and the ones with no dots are the curved corners, right? So if I hold down Option, I can't remember. Yeah, there we go. If I hold down Option and click on a point, I can turn it into a curve from a hard corner. And if I hold down Option again and click on it, I can make it a hard corner, right? So, these can all be used to take, I can either start from basic shapes and manipulate them in crazy ways, or I can create my own shapes using these tools. So we haven't even looked at using ellipses or stars or rounded rectangles, but what I would like you to do is just play and try and create a really basic scene. Maybe it's a landscape. Maybe you try and create like a really basic character using some of the tools that we've learned how to use thus far. And in the next tutorial, we'll actually have like a task to do, and we'll use some of these tools and we'll introduce some new tools to do that.